Tonight, the nation is witnessing an extraordinary and deeply destabilizing moment unfolding in Washington, D.C., one that threatens to shake the foundations of American governance itself. In the past several hours, a stunning wave of high-level resignations has ripped through the White House, signaling a breakdown unlike anything seen in modern political history. Senior officials are abandoning their posts in open defiance of President Donald J. Trump, who remains adamant in his refusal to step down despite overwhelming legal and political pressure. This is not another chapter in the familiar turbulence of Trump's presidency. This is a full-scale institutional rupture, unfolding in real time. The immediate catalyst for this crisis was President Trump's outright refusal to comply with a Supreme Court ruling issued earlier today. That ruling ordered the surrender of executive materials tied to ongoing investigations into election interference and the mishandling of classified documents connected to his previous campaigns. According to multiple sources close to the administration, the president's defiance prompted an emergency late-night meeting in the White House Situation Room, where senior officials privately concluded they could no longer serve without becoming complicit in what they described as constitutional violations. Within minutes, resignation letters began circulating and then leaking to major media outlets. These departures are not symbolic or ceremonial. They include the White House Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, and multiple deputy secretaries from critical departments such as Defense and Homeland Security. Their letters cite irreconcilable differences with the president's refusal to uphold the rule of law. Several express grave concern that continued service would directly undermine the constitutional order. One particularly stark letter, attributed to the acting attorney general, states that the president's defiance not only endangers national security, but erodes the very institutions officials swore to protect. The language is unambiguous. This is not routine dissent. It is a declaration that confidence in the executive branch has collapsed. Sources inside the Beltway indicate that this coordinated exit was not spontaneous. It had been quietly planned over the past week, following repeated and ultimately failed efforts to persuade the president to reverse course. What began as internal resistance has now surfaced as open institutional refusal. Compounding the crisis is a profound shift within the Republican Party itself. Longtime allies who once defended Trump aggressively are now conspicuously silent. Offices belonging to senior party figures have issued terse, no-comment statements, or nothing at all. Behind closed doors, reactions are described as panicked. Lawmakers are reportedly scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout, canceling joint appearances and avoiding public alignment. One senator, speaking anonymously, summarized the mood bluntly. Survival now requires cutting ties, not doubling down. This marks a decisive turning point. Political loyalty has given way to self-preservation. Figures who once rode Trump's populist momentum are now prioritizing their own political futures as midterm elections loom. As the resignations mount, the legal consequences are accelerating. Federal enforcement mechanisms have been activated. Contempt proceedings are now possible for non-compliance with court orders. Legal experts warn that continued defiance could lead to unprecedented steps, including personal court appearances or enforcement actions never before directed at a sitting president. Congress is preparing to reconvene in emergency session. Democrats are pushing forward impeachment articles, while some Republicans are reportedly open, privately, to removal proceedings. Even without immediate conviction prospects, the mere initiation of these processes further isolates the president institutionally. Behind the scenes, coordination across branches of government is intensifying. Career officials within the Justice Department have notified the White House that failure to comply within a narrow time frame will trigger formal contempt actions. Courts are moving swiftly, rejecting emergency filings and appeals on procedural grounds, citing the urgency of Supreme Court authority. Discussions surrounding the 25th Amendment have surfaced, though the mass resignations complicate the arithmetic required for invocation. Still, contingency planning is underway. Senior military officials have reportedly briefed congressional leaders on continuity of government protocols, emphasizing the integrity of the chain of command regardless of political turmoil. Globally, the shockwaves are immediate. Allies have expressed alarm, markets have reacted sharply, with futures plunging and investors fleeing to traditional safe havens. Foreign governments are reassessing diplomatic engagement, shifting communication away from political appointees and toward career officials. International headlines openly question whether American democracy is entering a period of systemic instability. Inside the United States, the atmosphere is tense and volatile. Protesters have begun gathering near the White House, divided between demands for immediate accountability and fierce demonstrations of loyalty. Security perimeters are expanding. Law enforcement presence is increasing. Officials are preparing for the possibility of unrest if the standoff persists. Within the executive residence itself, the president is reportedly surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists. Public statements remain defiant, accusing political enemies and the judiciary of betrayal and conspiracy. But engagement appears diminished, suggesting erosion even within his base. The crisis has now moved decisively beyond politics. It is no longer about rhetoric or messaging. It is about enforcement, mechanisms, and whether the constitutional system can compel compliance from a president who claims exemption from its authority. Three outcomes now dominate expert analysis: enforcement through legal mechanisms escalating toward physical compliance, collapse, marked by fragmented authority and emergency succession, or prolonged confrontation ending in removal through impeachment or constitutional processes. Each path carries historic consequences. As Washington settles into another sleepless night, the White House remains illuminated but unnervingly still. No routine movements, no public appearances, only tension. This moment is no longer about one individual. It is a stress test of the entire system, of checks and balances forged over centuries. Whether those guardrails hold will define not only this presidency, but the future boundaries of executive power itself. History is being written not through grand speeches or dramatic announcements, but through resignations, emergency filings, and the relentless turning of legal gears. The machinery is moving, and it does not stop for defiance. As the hours stretch deeper into the night, the consequences of this rupture continue to compound, moving with a momentum that now seems difficult to slow, let alone stop. What was once whispered speculation inside Washington has hardened into action across institutions that rarely move in public view. The system, long accused of inertia, is now responding with startling speed. Inside federal agencies, career officials, many of whom have served under presidents of both parties for decades, are making quiet but consequential decisions. Internal guidance is being circulated instructing staff to follow court orders and statutory obligations, regardless of conflicting directives from the White House. Legal counsel offices across departments are issuing written advisories warning that compliance with unlawful executive orders could expose individuals to personal, civil, and criminal liability. This shift is subtle but seismic. Authority is no longer assumed to flow unquestioned from the Oval Office. At the Department of Justice, the interim leadership drawn from senior career ranks has reportedly formalized procedures to preserve evidence and secure documents named in the Supreme Court ruling. Federal marshals have been placed on heightened readiness, not for immediate action, but in preparation for scenarios once considered unthinkable. Judges, mindful of the gravity of the moment, are coordinating schedules to ensure rapid response to any further escalation. On Capitol Hill, the atmosphere is equally charged. Lawmakers from both parties are arriving for closed-door briefings that extend late into the night. Staffers describe hallways buzzing with speculation, contingency planning, and hurried consultations with constitutional scholars. Draft impeachment language is circulating, focusing narrowly on obstruction of justice and defiance of judicial authority. Articles designed not for symbolism, but for speed. Republican leadership faces a reckoning of its own. The party's internal divide is no longer ideological but existential. Some members argue that continued association with the president risks permanent damage to the party's credibility and electoral viability. Others fear the reaction of a still powerful base. The result is paralysis in public and frantic calculation in private. Silence, once a tactic, now reads as retreat. Outside Washington, the ripple effects are spreading. State governments are activating their own continuity plans, particularly in states with large federal workforces or major military installations. Governors are coordinating with National Guard leadership, not in anticipation of deployment but as a precautionary measure should federal authority become contested or unclear. Financial markets continue to react to every new development. Analysts warn that prolonged uncertainty could trigger cascading effects. Delayed federal contracts, disrupted regulatory decisions, and shaken investor confidence. Major corporations are reportedly convening emergency board meetings to assess exposure to federal instability. Pension funds and institutional investors are recalibrating risk models built on the long-standing assumption of American political continuity. Internationally, the reassessment of U.S. reliability deepens. Diplomatic cables emphasize reassurance, continuity, and alliance commitments, but behind the formal language lies unease. Intelligence partners are reportedly limiting the scope of shared briefings until clarity returns. Military allies are reviewing command and control assumptions that depend on unquestioned civilian authority at the top of the U.S. government. Within the White House complex, the sense of isolation grows. Offices once bustling with staff now sit dark and empty. Phones go unanswered. Routine briefing materials remain unread. The president's ability to issue directives is increasingly constrained by a reality he can no longer fully control. Compliance now depends on consent, not command. The symbolic power of the presidency remains immense, but its practical power is eroding hour by hour. Each resignation, each refusal, each court filing tightens the circle. The presidency, stripped of cooperation, becomes a shell, visible, loud, but increasingly ineffective. Public sentiment is hardening as well. Polling organizations are rushing to capture opinion in real time, and early indicators suggest a nation deeply polarized but increasingly anxious. Even among supporters, fatigue and uncertainty are replacing confidence. Among critics, urgency has turned into insistence that resolution must come quickly before further damage is done. Experts warn that prolonged standoff is the most dangerous scenario of all, not because it favors one side, but because it corrodes trust across the board. Institutions function on legitimacy as much as law, and legitimacy frays when outcomes are delayed indefinitely. As dawn approaches again over Washington, the crisis has entered a new phase, not explosive but grinding. The initial shock has passed. What remains is endurance. Which institutions hold, which actors relent, and whether the constitutional framework can compel closure without violence or collapse. This is no longer a question of personality or politics. It is a test of whether a system designed to withstand ambition, defiance, and even bad faith can still enforce its own limits. Every hour without resolution sharpens that test. Every decision now carries historical weight, and whatever the outcome, the presidency, the parties, and the public will emerge changed, marked by a moment when the quiet machinery of democracy was forced to prove whether it still works when pushed to its absolute edge.